The investigation of possible crimes in New York is now yielding actual crimes because we have the crime of a death threat sent to a public official, the Manhattan DA, who is dealing with the Trump case. DA Bragg's office received, as we mentioned at the top of the broadcast, an envelope that contained white powder. Tests found it to be non-hazardous, and a death threat. The message, quote, "Alvin, I'm going to kill you." Officials today say Bragg's office has actually received several hundred threats in recent weeks. The physicality of this one, the fact that the powder had to be tested coming after Trump's public attacks, of course, add to the intensity. Bragg has said they will not tolerate attempts to intimidate his office. Trump has been escalating his violent rhetoric. We were just discussing this with two decorated prosecutors at the top of this broadcast. An indictment, Trump now says today, could lead to, quote, death and destruction. Well, death caused by what? He also posted, I'm going to show this briefly, an image of him holding a bat next to DA Bragg. This is what one prosecutor told us moments ago could contribute to a new count of a separate crime against a crime that would be, of course, indicted against Donald Trump. The Post says our country is being destroyed and they want us to be peaceful. You don't need to be a literary expert to see that the word peaceful there is being used as something they are demanding that he is opposing. Videos also being shared like this.
Our enemies are desperate to stop us because they know that we are the only ones who can stop them. And they're not coming after me, they're coming after you. I'm just standing in their way, and I always will stand in their way.
That is what's happening. That's what he's been posting this week, and the death threat, as I mentioned, that news of that broke today. If you have been following our coverage on this, we try to be very clear about what we know and what we don't. For example, it's not clear that Donald Trump will be indicted in New York or anywhere else. We're following the grand jury. If there is a trial, he's legally presumed innocent. And if we are looking at efforts to intimidate prosecutors in America, this is something that predates Trump. You can put all the polarized partisan media to the side and just look at the history, because we just did a special report on it this week. And if you watched, you may recall what I reported. Historically, efforts to intimidate prosecutors do not work in America. They do not stop investigations. And even in the tragic situations where there are incidents of violence, crimes committed, and sometimes people killed who are connected to prosecutors, which has happened in America, when you look back, those tragic crimes did not stop or prevent the investigations. Instead, they usually tend to add a new crime, as I mentioned, a new count to investigate. Now, far-right Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing something that fits with the entire upside-down narrative they're trying to push. She went to a D.C. jail that houses January 6 defendants, treating them, she says, like political prisoners. I'm joined by presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Ari.
History can be instructive. There are times in America where we look back and say, oh, there are things we've learned we could do differently. Sometimes that becomes almost overdone because, believe it or not, and you know this, for all of the ways America needs to continue to grow and improve, there is sometimes great nuggets of faith and courage in our history. And it seems that sometimes in the past, against the mafia, against Al Capone, against other arrayed threats, we've seen brave public officials. What does history teach us in this area?
Teaches us that our society is very vulnerable when we have the opposite. And that's why this night is different from other nights in American history. Never before have we had a president or an ex-president or a presidential candidate inciting violence, almost explicitly advocating the assassination of prosecutors and others who get in his way, which could lead to the downfall of our rule of law. We've had some bad presidents and some bad presidential candidates. We have never seen anything like this before. So let's not just look at this, and you're not, of course, but some people are, looking at this as just sort of another wacky story and Donald Trump melting down and saying all sorts of things on his social media. That's not what this is. This is an ex-president who is in legal danger, making an explicit threat intended, just as you just said, Ari, to intimidate prosecutors and others across the land. And the leaders of his party, as far as I can see, have not said a word against this.
No, they haven't, and on most of it, and you make a very important point there. I mean, McCarthy said at the very beginning of the week, people don't need to protest. But we need a lot more than that for safety when you have it this obvious, as we just showed. I'm curious what history teaches as well, Michael, about this type of division. We talk about ebb and flow of that in American history. What do you see today? Because you got people, the former president also called Bragg a, quote, animal, and you have this dehumanization appealing to our worst instincts.
And anti-Semitism, the so-called George Soros-backed prosecutor. This is no longer presidential history, Ari. To understand this, you have to look at the history of violence and terrorism in America. To the Confederate vigilantes and the Ku Klux Klan that advocated lynchings, and Father Coughlin in the 1930s, who went on the radio and gave rallies, and people went out from these rallies and beat up Jewish students on the streets. And even in the early 1960s, when President Kennedy went to Texas in the wake of radical right leaders championing his assassination and the assassination of civil rights leaders. What we've seen from Donald Trump with these threats of violence is a lot closer to that history than anything I've seen in the history of the presidency.
Your last point, I hope people digest, it's chilling but important, which is even the category, the taxonomy we use matters so much, right? If we assign political reporters to cover something, we get more political stories about the polling or the base. If we assign, as you said, domestic terror reporters to cover, in this case, I'm sad to say it, I wish it wasn't so, Donald Trump and some of his allies, then we get that kind of reporting. And it's sort of, that's part of the lens. Again, I said all fairness and legally presumed innocent in a trial, but the security implications are real. We lived through the insurrection, and we're living through a doubling down right now.